So, welcome everyone. This is Tuesday, November 17th, 2020. We're here with Ed Smith, an African American game developer and entrepreneur who's here to tell us about some of his amazing life story. Ed, thank you and welcome for being with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Doug.
So, you've had a really interesting life. And why don't we start at the beginning and tell us, could you tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what it was like growing up in your area?
Yeah, I can. So I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, um, during some very tough times, the 50s, 60s, when there was a lot of turmoil going on. And there was a lot of crime, of course, drug addiction, a lot of ways to fail rather than succeed. Yet somehow I was able to overcome those desires that were out there and get into the world of technology.
Right. Now, I think the area that you lived in was called Brownsville. Could you tell us a bit about that and what it was like to live there?
Yeah, so Brownsville in Brooklyn was a environment where you had multiple housing units, high-rise housing units that were called projects. And these housing units were stacking African Americans up um, and not giving them a lot of opportunity to see anything other than the environment that they had to both grow up in and live in and come home from work into that same environment. And Brownsville, again, was that environment, that community that permeated the use of alcohol, drugs, crime. It was very demoralizing, and there was a reason for that. In Brownsville, many of the folks who grew up there, they just gave up. The environment was so bad, you really just did not see a way out. And that was the biggest problem that I saw growing up in that environment. And I always wondered why many of the folks that I grew up with would just give up. And it happened so often that even today, the folks that I grew up with are either in jail or dead.
Hmm. Oh, so sorry to hear that. Um, how did you manage to, you know, hang on? And did you get any encouragement from your folks or friends or family or?
You know, I really did not have any mentors, anyone that would encourage me to do the things that I chose to do. It was really on me. And I have no idea how I came to the decision to do the things that I did. To this day, it shocks me that I did what I did. And when I think back on it, I'm thinking, okay, I knew I wanted to just, get an education, learn some things about technology, try to get a good job, and try to get out of Brownsville. But I really didn't have much encouragement from anyone um, who was a mentor or people that I would look up to and would tell me, this is what you should do. It really just came to me, I guess, um, on my own, and mainly because of the work that I would do around the neighborhood, around Brownsville, fixing appliances, you know, um, and I really got the bug for electronics. And I just decided, well, if I'm going to do anything in my life, maybe I should just go ahead and see if I can get into a magnet high school and study technical electronics. And that's exactly what I did.
That's wonderful. So you saw education as the way out.
Yes.
Right. Now, what I want to learn more about your going around and fixing things. Tell us more about that, and how did you learn to do that?
It's again one of those things that just comes natural to some people. I can remember, I think it was the first thing I fixed was a toaster, right? My mom had a toaster and the toaster wouldn't work and it was a bad filament. And I went down to Radio Shack, I think, or someplace, and I got another filament and put it in and it worked. And then I tried something else. I think it was a vacuum cleaner after that. And then the word got out in the neighborhood that I could fix things. And all of a sudden, I had my bedroom filled up with these appliances. And it was pretty simple for me to deconstruct these things, figure out where the problem was, and then get the right part and get it working again.
That's amazing. Did you have any like what kind of things were you reading? How did you gain this knowledge, or did you just sort of work your way through it?
Well, I started fixing things when I was really young. I'm thinking maybe 10 or 11 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. When I fixed that toaster, I was 10 years old. Yeah. And I can even remember when I was um, fooling around with it. And one day I plugged it in to see if it would work. I still had the entire housing that was open, and I touched the contact, and I got my first shock.
Ah,
And
yes.
I said, "Okay, I know how that feels."
Yes.
But what
I
I didn't know was what the um, premise behind electrical current was like. So that got me even more curious as to understand why people did get shocked and
oh,
why electrical current was the way it was. So I did a lot of studying about electricity. I would visit the Radio Shack store often because that's where everything was that you wanted. And I felt that I could just learn these things on my own. And as I got older, maybe by the time I was 13, I got into high school, I started reading some of the popular electronics magazines, Popular Science. Omni magazine was out, I think, back then, maybe not. But there were a couple of really good magazines that just showed you some of the things that were out there and how they worked.
right. Now, New York was a particularly fertile area. I'm saying New York as in, I'm not a New Yorker, so I'm just going to say like the whole five boroughs, but you'll know what I mean. I think like Canal Street or something was a
Yes.
place where there was a lot of war surplus electronic stuff, and people like to go there. Did you ever go down there and was that a source for you of parts or knowledge going to some of these many electronic shops in New York?
Yeah, Dag, I actually lived on Canal Street.
Oh,
So,
wow.
again, this is as I got older, I started doing the fixing things in the neighborhood. And as I started getting older and started fixing more things and started to uh, build some things, Canal Street was my technology haven. I could go there and I can get parts for anything that I wanted. And
Wow.
it was just an amazing place to be. And more importantly, because the people who were there were just like me. They wanted to learn different things, they wanted to get information, and the people on Canal Street were more than happy to share what they knew with the folks who would shop around their environment. It was the best world for me as a kid trying to learn technology.
Wow. And I think if I'm right, sort of recalling my own experiences, like people are very kind to youngsters usually, and they're very forthcoming with information. Did you find that too? Like being a little younger, sort of people really went out of their way to be nice to you and explain things and
Yeah, it's interesting that I learned at a very young age that if you ask questions of folks, they give you the answers that you need to have. So they are more than willing to help you as long as you're willing to reach out and ask the questions. So yes, I was able to go there on a regular basis. When I had a problem, I would ask the questions. They would give me the advice that I needed, tell me what type of a part I needed to get, tell me what type of circuitry I needed to get. They were very good at leading me in the right direction.
Are there any people of color in this world, the electronics world, that you could relate to, or?
Sorry, Dag, I am it.
Ah, okay. So that is kind of what I
There
thought.
was,
But yeah.
it's unfortunate that, growing up in Brownsville, no one was thinking about studying technical electronics, very few people. Um, and Again, I'm not sure how I got looped into it, but none of my friends, no one that I knew in the neighborhood or even outside of the neighborhood was involved in anything around electronics.
Tell us a little bit about the high school years now. So you're 13, 14, and you're just starting high school. Um, what was that? What was high school like for you? And did you have any extracurricular interests at all? Or?
So high school was probably one of the best things that happened to me. And again, it's because, I spent half the day in a technical electronics class.
Mm,
And I had a great teacher who would educate me the right way, who would give me the opportunity to show other students what to do because I was one of the better students. And it was the best thing I could have ever done as a youth in high school to be able to go to Westinghouse and study technical electronics. My teacher back then, his name was Mr. Russian. And for the first 2.5 years, he taught my electronics class. But then he passed away.
ah,
So my final year in Westinghouse was not the best year because I was really bummed out. I can tell you that.
mm,
When I lost that was one of the first mentors I really did have.
uh-huh.
And when I lost Mr. Russian, I really felt bad. I really didn't even want to go to school anymore. So I was on my way to being at the top of the class, ready to get a scholarship at RPI, Rensselaer Polytech Institute.
Right.
All of these things were right in front of me when I was a junior. By the time I became a senior, I stopped going to a lot of classes. I barely passed tests. I went from an A student to a B student very quickly, and I lost my scholarship.
Mhm. Now, in the last as a senior, what was your next step?
Well, a lot of things happened at that time when I was a senior in high school. Um, Personally, I was just about to have my first child.
Yeah.
So this is another thing that caused me to be, I guess, bummed out. I realized that I had to finish school and get a job because there was a child on the way. And I was not one of those deadbeat dads. I really felt it was important for me to take care of my child.
Mhm.
So my last year in high school was really just about I want to get this thing done. I want to get out of high school and I want to get a job and start paying some bills so that I can raise my new family. But that's not to say I never thought about going back to school, which I did, but I knew I had to get my foundation in place.
Mhm. Now, what year would this have been?
This was 1972.
Okay, thank you. Well, so that, yeah, there's a lot going on in society and the world.
Oh yeah.
Definitely very turbulent times. Um, well, what did you do? Did you find work right away and begin working?
Yeah, I guess the good news is when you attend a school like Westinghouse, and you get out, a lot of the businesses know of the school and had no problem hiring someone who had that level of education. So I think when I got out of Westinghouse, I got a job. Let's see, this was, yeah. So I got a job uh, making computer operated surveillance systems. It was called COPS, even though there were no computers at the time. It just had a catchy name to it.
Mhm.
But I went to this factory environment in Long Island, and I was responsible for building the prototype for this new surveillance system. And I did that for about a year. I knew it wasn't a permanent position.
Okay.
And once I completed that, I was on to looking for other work that I could get.
Can you tell us a little bit about the technology involved? Are this transistors or ICs at this point, or?
Yeah. So for the computer surveillance system, it was all transistors.
Okay.
So it was just a matter of not just the transistors themselves, but connecting a television set in a person's home over the coax cable to a central unit so that when someone rang the doorbell, the person in the apartment can turn it to a channel 3, I think it was, and they could see who was at the door.
Well, now doesn't that sound familiar today?
Yeah, yeah,
Except
exactly. I
40
got my
years.
Ring doorbell that does that for me pretty easily now.
Exactly. Oh, that's wonderful. So that's very interesting. Did the company make a go of it, or uh, how did they make
Yeah,
out?
they did well, and I honestly don't know what happened to them because, for some reason, the technology never took off in any of the apartments that I visited. So maybe it was in some of the other apartments in Midtown, I guess, where a lot of the money was.
Right.
Uh, I didn't see it happening in my neighborhood.
Interesting. So was that involved the design and construction of a prototype, that job,
Correct.
and then that went into production?
And then they went into production. I did help to install the first unit at one of the housing complexes in Lower Manhattan.
Oh, yeah.
So I connected it up to the different levels, different floors in the building, and got it to work. And it was a nice system. It really was. And I think it was all about the crime during the time,
Hmm.
which is what made this thing very popular because a lot of people were coming into these housing units
Oh,
with ill intentions.
right. Okay. What happened next? Okay, this is picking up part two here with Ed Smith. So Ed, can you tell us about your child, if that's not too personal? Did you mentioned becoming a father and as a senior, and were things were you had starting a new family, I guess, at this time?
Yeah, when you're 18 years old and you have a child, um, you don't have a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge. You really don't know what to do. Luckily, I have or had a mother who was very helpful, and my wife, and we're still married today, and we've had a second child since then. She was great, and the two of us together, we pretty much figured it out. And I can tell you that there were some ups and downs, but at the end of the day, we knew that we were going to stick it out. We were going to raise our daughter, and we were going to make the best life we could out of the environment that we were in.
Right. Thank you for sharing that with us. So after the COPS, can you spell COPS? Is it COP as in Peter? S?
COPS,
Okay.
COPS, computer operated,
Oh, I see. The ops is operated. Yeah,
computer
so
operated policing system.
got it. Thank you. Okay. Um, well, what happened next?
So after I did that short stint for this company, they were called Futuronics. Um, I had to find another job, and I also registered to attend Pace University.
Hmm.
The job I found was at a company called Marbolite, and Marbolite was a firm that manufactured traffic control units for the state of New York, the state of California, the state of Florida. Many different states would procure Marbolite traffic systems, and these systems were solid state, mechanical, and they were multi-intersectional units. And I was hired to test those traffic systems.
Okay. And now this is the box that switches the lights on and off. Is that essentially what these?
That's it.
Yeah, right. And so I imagine, like you say, it's transistors. It's probably like stepper motors or something, or relays
Yes,
of some
servo
kind.
motors. Yes, absolutely. So you could, if it was a solid state unit, you would have a series of motor drives in there, and you would have pinouts so that as the motor turned, depending where the pin was, it would click on a light.
Right.
And if you had three motors running at the same time, you could have one click on a light, one could click on a don't walk sign, one could click on something else,
Ah,
that
right.
kind of thing.
So this is the thing we all wish we could get in and change when we're stuck behind a red light for too long, right?
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. I can tell you one quick story about that. When
Sure.
I was doing that work, I was in the neighborhood one day, and I was going somewhere. I don't recall where, but there was a traffic signal that was out in the street, a big intersection.
Mm.
So the lights were just flashing, cars were
Oh yeah.
blowing their horns at each other. It was pretty much chaos. And there was a person who was going to the box, the main box,
Okay.
and that person was, I think he was a policeman. I guess
Oh,
it
okay.
turns out that policemen have the key to the box so that they can turn on and turn off the flashers.
Mm.
So I wanted to walk up to the cop and say, I can fix that for you. And then I thought better of it because he probably would look at me and say, there is no way you even know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Right. I think one of the early applications for the microprocessor was exactly that application. Did you, Intel's first chip, the 4004, was one of the applications they advertised was traffic control, traffic light control. Was your company using the microprocessor yet, or was it still discrete components and mechanical, electromechanical stuff?
For the first 2 years when I was there, it was mechanical and electrical mechanical solid state. And then we had the introduction of the microprocessor. And that's really the thing that changed my life for the better again. Again, I was one of the best people they had as far as testing those systems. And when it came to the design of these new traffic systems and the testing of these new traffic systems, I and another one of the employees were tapped to work on those systems. So yes, that was the launch pad for me as far as getting my education around microprocessor technology.
Now, one of the interesting things about the microprocessor is, in a way, it kind of reset everyone, all engineers to kind of go back and learn this stuff because it was new, not just for you who were, you were still early to the field, but even to, older, more veteran engineers. They didn't know what the microprocessor was either, and so. You know what I mean? It kind of everyone became on at the same level. All of a sudden, everyone needed to learn this newfangled microprocessor stuff and understand how hardware was sort of somewhat transitioning to software a little bit.
Yes,
And so how did
yes.
you learn about the microprocessor? How did you learn how they work and how to program them and that kind of thing?
So the company came to that came to Marblite was Fairchild.
Ah,
So Fairchild introduced Marblite to their microprocessor set. And since we were tapped to do the work on those units, I went to a facility in Fairchild to study their microprocessors. So I spent maybe 3, 4 months or so at Fairchild simply studying the architecture of the microprocessors, of the microchip.
wow. So now was this in a different, was this back in Silicon Valley? You had to travel to go to Fairchild or
No, no. In fact,
no?
so Marblite was a company, it was a factory environment in downtown Brooklyn.
Mhm.
Um,
Oh,
the the Fairchild folks had a facility in New Jersey.
okay.
So we went to New Jersey to get the training on the Fairchild chip.
Okay.
And we took that training back to Marblite to implement it in those traffic systems.
Wow, that's really great. So you're one of the first generation of engineers to learn the microprocessor and how to use it. In,
And that's an interesting point because when I was doing it, I had no idea what I was doing. First generation of anything, it didn't matter to me. What
Mm.
really mattered was I got a pretty cool job. That's what mattered to me.
Yeah, and they kind of supported you to go out and learn new things, that's pretty unusual for companies. So that's great. So they must have seen a lot of potential in the microprocessor. Did you see a lot of potential in the microprocessor at that time?
Oh, I saw all types of potential in the microprocessor. It wasn't just, in the traffic systems. I mean, you had microprocessors ending up in your watch during
Mm.
those times, in calculators, in adding machines. They were showing up in places that you would think there's probably no way it's going to happen. So all of a sudden, I say a very short period of time, 2 or 3 years, processors, chips were coming out in everything and everywhere, right? You had VCRs that had chips in them. You had all types of devices, stereo systems with chips in them. So the processor became the foundation for all of the new technology that was coming out at that time. And if you bring it all back to what you see today, there's not a single device that you own that you plug in that probably does not have a chip in it.
Exactly. Yes. Um, just to get the specifics, was it the F8 microprocessor that you were learning about, Fairchild's? Uh,
That was the F8, and that was the same processor that uh, I'm going a little bit ahead, but that was the same processor that was used to design one of the first video games by
right,
a guy named Jerry Lawson, which was the Channel F.
right. And Jerry Lawson is another African American engineer. So you two are sort of twin spirits in many ways.
Yeah, I wish I had a chance to really get to know Jerry, and unfortunately I did not.
Yeah, he passed away too early.
Yeah.
Um, well, so you're at Marblite, and can tell us, did your work change once you got the microprocessor training? How did your work change?
So once I got the training on the microprocessor and I was doing the work at Marblite, things were going very well. We started to put our designs from based on what we learned into production. So we started to get the first units out into the street that were microprocessor operated traffic systems. I think the state of New York was the first to purchase them.
Mhm.
But that's when I realized, and again, this is because I started reading many, many different publications. I was a very, very avid reader. I would read so many different technical publications, it would just boggle your mind. There was so much to learn, so much more that you could, absorb,
Hmm.
that I wanted to absorb it all. So I decided, based on what I was learning and reading, that even though the job at Marblite was pretty cool, there was a lot of other things going on that were even better. And I wanted to be a part of that bigger world of technology. So I started looking elsewhere. And I was lucky enough to find the next job. And that job was at APF Electronics because they were involved in video game designs. So again, as I was reading all of these different publications, looking at the industry, um, the pizza shop arcades were a big hit back then, and I wanted to be at the leading edge of all of that. And if I could, I would take that opportunity to take that knowledge that I had at Marblite, and I was able to take that to APF and help them to design some of the new things that they were looking to design around next generation video games. Keep in mind, when I started with APF, they had one game and it was called TV Fun, which was basically Pong,
Okay.
right? So they wanted to move to the next generation. And for that to happen, they needed a cartridge based video game, color graphics, um, joysticks, IO that was going to give you additional functionality if you needed it. And they needed people who understood microprocessor technology. Now, this is in New York City. There's a lot of people who knew microprocessor technology on the West Coast,
Hmm.
but trying to find people who knew this on the East Coast in New York, well, that was a challenge. There was not a lot of people who knew microprocessor technology on the East Coast. So when I saw the opportunity from an advertisement, I jumped all over it and I got the job. And I got the job because I really did understand the technology. A lot about, the architecture, bus architecture specifically, because when you're talking about even with the traffic systems, it's all about bus technology. And that's
Mhm.
the piece that I brought to the table at that time.
That's great. I have a little technical question for you. Did you have any trouble with noise immunity when you switched to using microprocessors in a traffic application, which is switching some high currents, but I guess it's really relays that are switching the currents, but
No, no, not really.
they
We
were
mitigated
reliable.
it.
Sorry, go ahead, please.
No, I was saying, I really didn't see any issues with noise immunity. It just we if there was any issues, we were able to mitigate that through additional functionality that we would build into the device.
Right. Okay. Well, APF now, they're a very interesting company. It actually stands for the names of the founders, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, Al and Phil Friedman.
Okay, wonderful. And now
Catchy stuff.
they, you tell us a bit about the company, just as for background. Did you know anything about them before you joined, and what did you learn once you were there?
I knew absolutely nothing about this company until I joined them. But then once I did join them, I started to find out quite a bit about this company. And one thing I found out was the company was owned by uh, folks who were Jewish, and they had a military background. And a lot of the stuff that they did in the military was around electronics. And they had a lot of people who spent time overseas working on building things for the Army and the Navy.
Okay.
So the owners of APF, they took their military training and started this company.
Okay. And were their customers initially, they were military and then they switched to a consumer company, or how did that transition work? Because they
Well,
made
this,
calculators, I think, right? They made like, that was
yeah,
they were very big in calculators for a while.
very big on calculators. It was before my time when they were doing the other stuff around the military
Mm,
devices, although I knew this was something they did. By the time I was with APF, they had moved completely into the consumer electronics world. And I think a lot of the reasons for that had to be with the way at that time that firms in Japan, in Taiwan, all of these different countries in Asia would manufacture low cost knockoff devices that would be shipped here into the US.
mm.
So APF at that time, quite frankly, they were a knockoff provider of consumer electronics products.
Okay. And their manufacturing was in Asia.
Manufacturing was all done in Asia, everything
Okay.
shipped here to the US and then sold in the US.
Right. Uh, I know with the Pong game, I think you said it was called TV Fun.
Yes,
Was that based on the General Instrument chip that all the clone
same chip,
makers? Yeah,
same chip. Yep.
right. Okay. Well, tell us about your first project then at APF and what they had you working on.
Yeah, so when I joined APF, the first thing they said to me is, you need to make sure that you are able to do the design work and build out the prototypes and draft the schematics and test these games as quickly as possible because we don't have a lot of time to waste. So this was a rapid development environment.
Mm.
So for the first month that I was at APF, I spent hours with the engineering team, mainly laying out the architecture for that second generation video game, which was called the MP1000. And the design work we did at that time was, I thought it was pretty cool. You know, there were not too many 8-bit video games, color video games at that time, and we had one of them. So we designed that architecture. And the thing about this is, I'm a hardware guy. So
Right.
I learned microprocessor technology. I learned how to build out a, a, a console. I learned how to allow for a cartridge to be inserted into the console without blowing it up, which was Jerry Lawson's design.
Mhm.
So I learned that, but I was not a game programmer. So we had the game programmers who would write the games.
Right.
My job was to make sure that console could handle the games.
Okay, so well, the MP1000 sounds interesting. It's kind of like, where did it fit in the marketplace? Because you mentioned it had color, which is unusual at the time. Um, and I guess it used an RF modulator, I suppose, to connect to people's TV. They would hook it up to their TV.
That's exactly right. So it was RF modulator, connect to a color TV. Um, and yeah, that was it. You could play multiple video games. There was a built-in video game, and there were the cartridges that you would purchase. And we tried to get cartridges out that were fun. I'm not going to say that we had some of the best video games out there, but we had some fun video games out there. Um, and I think one of the better video games that we did at the time was one that everybody was doing at the time, which, we called ours Space Destroyers, but there was Space Invaders. So we had our version of that. We did a Rock'em Sock'em Robot video game.
Oh, yes.
We did Backgammon, Hangman, um, a number of different games that were just fun games to play. Um, and I think it was pretty cool.
Now, what kind of memory did you have on the cartridges to write to work with when you were when the software people were writing the code to do the game? Do you remember the size of the ROMs they had in those cartridges at all? Like
Yep, 8K.
8K.
Not a lot.
Okay.
That's not a
Yeah.
lot.
No.
That's
No,
very
that's amazing.
tight.
Yeah. Amazing. And so did the machine have a switches how did you select the different games on the MP1000?
Well, they were all cartridge based, right?
Oh, I'm
So
sorry. That's right. Of
yeah,
course. Right.
yeah. So you pull out a cartridge and you plug another cartridge in and play a different game.
Got it. What was the microprocessor in that game?
That was a heated discussion we had when we came up with the design,
I'm sure.
and we settled in on, which was at that time, I guess, um, revolutionary, and that was a Motorola 6800 microprocessor.
Mm, okay.
Yeah, and the reason was that Motorola was trying to get into the market aggressively, and they had some of the best pricing available to us. And when you're talking about a company like APF who's building knockoffs and everything is about cost,
Hmm.
you know, the Motorola processor for us was half the cost of the other ones.
Wow. I know that Steve Wozniak, when he did the Apple One, I'm sure you know this too, he left a slot for the 6800, so you could put either a 6800 or a 6502
6502, yeah.
in the board, probably
Yep.
for the same reason, right? Cost. So, um, okay. And well, how did that do in the marketplace, the MP1000?
Well, we sold thousands of those units.
Hmm.
Our biggest distributor was Sears.
Oh,
So
wow.
every Sears store across the country had the MP1000.
Now that must have been pretty nice for you to be able to walk into a Sears and see your work. Did you ever do that just for fun?
Yeah, I would love to tell you it was a good story, but
Oh no.
the the story is that um, I was taking my wife and my daughters shopping for school clothes, and we're at the mall, and I see the Sears store there, and we go into Sears. My wife takes my daughters over to the kids section to look at clothes. Naturally, I wander right into the electronics section. And lo and behold, right there was, along with the Atari and other games, the MP1000. And I got so excited to see that game sitting there that I walked up to the salesperson and I said, "Hey, I helped design that game." That salesperson gave me such a look of disbelief that he just completely crushed everything that was in my mind at that time.
Oh
And I
no.
walked out of that Sears store so dejected that I
Oh,
never brought up the fact that I did that ever again.
oh, Ed,
Yep.
I'm so sorry.
That's the nature of the color of your skin, unfortunately, Dag.
So sorry. Uh, well, tell us what happened at APF after the. What was the next product there?
Yeah. So, this is the industry. This is the fun stuff that was going on at the time. The industry again was moving so fast. Um, Year after year, something different was going on. So it started with video games, and then all of a sudden, personal computers started to come up. Apple started to have their success. Um, so we felt at APF that we may be able to have a position in the market that was different from Apple, different from Radio Shack, and from the others who were primarily hobbyist systems.
Hmm,
What
right.
we were talking about at APF through a lot of discussions was we want to build a personal computer console to the MP1000 video game. Keep in mind, all of the processing power for that personal computer was already in the MP1000.
Hmm,
All we had to do was expand it out to a computer console. And since we already had a number of our units sold for the video game,
mhm.
we thought all we had to do was to manufacture a nice console. People who owned the MP1000 would buy the console unit and turn their video game into a personal computer.
Right.
That was the concept, and that's what we did. We went ahead and we built the Imagination Machine personal computer based on the MP1000 video game.
Wonderful. Now, first of all, I have to ask about the name. So that's an amazing machine, an amazing name. Very very evocative and positive. So tell us about that. How did they come up with the name?
So we had a guy who was in our marketing department. His name was John Ruggiero. And John came up with the advertising slicks for the game and for the personal computer. And he came up with the name Imagination Machine. And his idea was that this is not a hobbyist thing.
Okay.
This is a home environment, a
Mhm.
home computing environment. And it's supposed to be a system that would allow for you to play games, to do your home finances, maybe do some word processing so you can do your homework. But
Nice.
it was never meant to be anything more than that.
Okay. Was there a thought of maybe offering a printer? This is part three with Ed Smith and Dag Spicer. So, Ed, you were just telling us a little bit about the imagination machine, and I had asked you if there was a thought to perhaps adding peripherals like a printer or other things to that. Was that in the product plan at all?
Yeah, so that's the whole idea around the imagination machine was you could have this expansion bus connected to the imagination machine, and through that expansion bus, you could add additional cartridges, if you will. And one of the cartridges was an RS-232 cartridge, which would allow you to connect to a printer. There was also a Centronics cartridge if you wanted to connect to a Centronics printer. The RS-232 cartridge would also allow you to connect to a modem.
Right. What about the software side? There's always a disconnect, as you know, between the hardware and the software. The software is almost always behind the hardware. What kind of software was offered with the Imagination Machine?
So the Imagination Machine, when we first introduced it to the marketplace, the software that came with it was a basic programming cartridge so that you could actually go ahead and do basic programming.
Right.
It also had a personal finance cartridge.
Nice.
It had a word processing cartridge, and it had a spreadsheet cartridge. So those were the first pieces for the Imagination Machine.
That's amazing. What about the keyboard? How did that plug in, or was there a connector on the front or something? Or?
Well, the entire concept of the Imagination Machine was you had this console unit, right?
Okay, so
And
it's
the console unit had the keyboard. It had the tape drive built into it so that you can store data. So all of that was a part of the console, and the MP1000 video game would sit on top of that console. And there was a connection between the MP1000 game and the Imagination Machine console that was called the J connector, which I designed, that married the two systems.
Okay, now I understand. That's great. So the Imagination Machine was essentially a way to add on to the MP1000, to add on and to expand the ecosystem that the MP1000 had.
Exactly. That's
created.
exactly right. So you started with the MP1000, and once you were able to connect the MP1000 to the Imagination Machine console, from that point, you could build it out to many, many other different things.
Right. So the Imagination Machine itself requires the MP1000. It's not a standalone computer.
That's correct.
Okay, got it. That's great. Uh, well, tell us, I'm kind of curious about the industrial design. This is kind of a side issue, I guess, but is there any interesting stories about how, why it's the shape and the color and that it is? And, any interesting design choices that were made? I think there's some wood grain paneling on the sides or something.
Yeah, on the MP1000, yes, there was always, I guess, a design concept that said, for a video game, you had to have this wood grain look to it.
Right.
Even everybody had it. Atari had it. I don't know why. And it was weird to me, but that's what they did. However, when it came to the personal computer part of it, all of that went right out of the door. There was no wood grain design. In fact, it was all plastic injection molding.
Mm. And this, of course, was made in Asia, offshore.
Yes.
Right. And what was Sears and Montgomery Ward, which you didn't mention before, but I think I read in an article they were also a big customer of yours, Montgomery Ward.
Sears and Montgomery Ward, yes.
Did they also adopt the Imagination Machine in their
Oh,
store?
yeah. In fact, this is when my career really was skyrocketing, I could say. Once I was getting the work done on the Imagination Machine and we started shipping that unit, we started putting it into production. One of the first things I was asked to do was to go to Chicago. And again, you're talking about a kid from Brooklyn who really never traveled, to get on a plane and go to Chicago and meet with the executives at Sears.
Wow.
And I can only tell you that this was the most invigorating thing that ever happened to me as a young man, to go into the Sears Tower and go to the top of the Sears Tower where they actually had a boardroom.
Wow.
And I'm standing there looking out at Lake Michigan, something I've never seen before in my life.
Mm.
And I'm standing there in awe. And for a while, it took me a little bit I had to bring myself back to say, you got to remember why you're here. And once I took all of that in, yes, I had then presented the imagination machine to the executives at Sears, and they they ate it up. They loved it. They thought this was one of the best things for their consumers
Mhm.
that they could sell. So they took
Wow.
thousands of units to sell along with the MP1000.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Now that must have been
And
quite a from coming where you grew up to standing at the top of a Sears Tower must have been quite a moment for you.
it's funny because growing up in New York, in Brooklyn, all of my life, I had never even considered going into the Empire State Building,
Mm.
right? And going up to the top of the Empire State Building. That didn't, that was never a thought that I had. But when I got into Chicago and I got to that Sears Tower and I looked out and I saw that view, I was just in awe. And it was at that time that I realized I had gotten to it exactly where I wanted to be in my career.
That's amazing. How old were you at that time?
I was 24 years old.
Wow. That's awesome. Yeah. Well, so the meeting went well, and to say the least. And what was the reaction when you got back to work? Were they? Oh, they were must have been very happy with your performance.
Yeah, yeah, they were very happy. Again, the reason they took me with them to pitch the imagination machine was because the salespeople at APF, I mean, they could sell a video game, but they
Mhm.
couldn't talk, RAM, ROM, and all of that on the personal computer side.
Right.
So I was the guy who was going through the technical architecture of the imagination machine. And when Sears went ahead and placed the order, I got back to my drafting table, I think it was at that time.
Mhm.
And the sales guy comes up to me and pats me on the back, tells me what a great job I did, and then tells me that he just made $20,000 that month. I only made $18,000 the entire year.
Oh,
So
yeah.
that was a revelation to me at that time as well.
Oh, yeah. You can't compete with sales. They're always going to make. That's a lesson you learned early.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
these things were happening to me, as I said, moving so fast. I had
Yeah.
no idea what salespeople did.
Right.
Right? I'm
Right.
just this tech guy. I'm just doing my thing, and this like, you made what? It shocked me, right?
Oh, yeah. Definitely. Well, did that influence your thinking or later career decisions at all? That to be more sales oriented or to,
I think my decision making was kind of thrust on me, right? Because again, at APF, we had the imagination machine. It was selling. The salespeople really didn't know what they were doing, so I was going out with the salespeople, pushing the machines with them. And I said to my boss, if I'm going to help these guys sell it, I need to get a part of the commission. And at one point, I actually did do that.
good.
So I moved from an engineering role, design engineer, which was what I was hired for. And all of a sudden, it's like overnight, I became a technical specialist. And that role, technical specialist, over the years that I've been in technology, meant that you were a pre-sales guy. You know, you had the technical knowledge that you could share with a customer. And because you were able to share that and help close a deal, you got a commission.
Right.
And that's the role that I played.
Right. I was going to ask exactly, and you sort of answered it a little bit. Was how important were feeds and speeds, as we used to call them in the old days, that the specs, like how much did people care? And then related to that is, who were your competitors in the market?
Yeah. Well, first of all, as far as feeds and speeds were concerned, it was all about the chip manufacturers. They were the guys who would determine your feeds and your speeds. So it was Motorola for us, and for others it could have been Intel, Fairchild, etc. But we all had the same environment as far as an 8-bit system that we worked with. So that didn't change. Um, the competitors were companies like Radio Shack with the TRS-80, Apple, of course. By the way, Atari announced that they were going to build a console for their video game. And that's why we did it first. We wanted to get the jump on Atari. But they never did come out with a console for that video game, the 2600.
Okay, so they had the same
So,
idea,
yeah,
but didn't do it.
didn't do it.
Right. Now, just to skip back a little bit, you mentioned you went to Pace University for a little bit. Can you tell us just a bit? I know this is out of time sequence, but I wanted to just close the loop on that, what you studied there and
Hmm.
for how long?
So when I decided to take up computer technology at Pace, I honestly did not know what I was getting into. Now, keep in mind, I had just started working at Marble at the time, designing traffic control systems based on microprocessor technology. At Pace, and I found this to be true over the years, universities are slow to catch up to the innovations that go on the outside.
Yes.
So at Pace, they had me studying Fortran and Epsidic, which was
Oh,
punch cards.
yeah. Oh boy.
And I'm at Pace and I'm thinking, why am I doing this? This makes
Yeah.
no sense,
Right.
you know? But
Kind of a
that's
blank.
exactly the environment that I was in at Pace.
Right.
Luckily, they had a great marketing program and I did very well there.
Oh, good. So you did get some use out of the studies there.
Yes,
Yeah.
indeed.
But the technology courses were kind of a washout. It sounds like they were not
Oh,
helping.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It was just, I was shocked. I just didn't realize that depending on the university that you are going to, and most of them are going to be um, laggards. Very few of them are going to be innovators. I would say Stanford is an innovative university.
Mhm.
MIT is an innovative university. Most universities, however, are not innovative at all. They are teaching you what is already out there in the world for you to get a job around, not something that you can build from scratch, and take it with you as a new career.
Right. I think too it's somewhat true that we've moved what used to be electrical engineering. I mean, it's still called that, but it's essentially become computer science in that so much of the hardware skills are have transitioned into a software world. And like to circuit design, for example, if you were doing like an ASIC or an FPGA, it's essentially a software problem now. you know
Absolutely. Yeah.
uh,
In fact, you're right. Most of it is a software problem. Even chip designs are a software problem these days.
Right. Yeah. So I remember Bob Pease. I don't know if you remember that name. He was a famous analog circuit designer in the Valley here. He wrote articles and so on. He used to make fun of people who spent too much time doing theoretical studies of their circuits, like running spice models, for example, of the circuits, and without actually building them. And he said, my favorite programming language is solder. So he said,
Solder.
you
I
gotta
like
build the
that.
circuit, take measurements and really see how it works. You can't just live in the computer. So
That's
anyway,
nice. I like that.
yeah, I thought you would as a hardware guy.
Yeah. I can
uh,
smell the solder now.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not that healthy for you, as it turns out.
No.
No. Well, now tell us about APF now, just as a company, how it was managed, and do you feel it was run well, or how did they do financially?
Well, APF, again, they started out, as I mentioned, as a consumer electronics company, mainly to be able to import consumer electronics products. And for that piece of the business, they did well. The thing that happened to APF was the desire for them to move quickly to get a large share of a market that they thought was out there and to invest heavily into that, only to see that market completely dry up. So even though APF was a great company, great people, the imagination machine just didn't sell as well as they thought it would. And the main reason was, even though the concept was there as a family video game and personal computer, families were not buying personal computers. Accountants were buying them, writers were buying them, hobbyists were buying them, but no one who had a family was plucking down $400 for a personal computer at that time. It just wasn't happening. So that market for a family system
Mhm.
didn't materialize until years later.
That's really interesting because,
Yeah.
excuse me, you see a lot of advertising, and maybe I just don't have the years right, but it was probably the period you're referring to later, where, excuse me, you see a lot of advertising geared towards educational. Like if you don't buy this computer, your kids will fall behind in school. That kind of messaging, you need the computer to keep up, and those kind of very direct educational appeal to customers. But did that come later then, do you think, or
It came after the
the game?
introduction of the imagination machine.
Right. And then
Yeah.
there's sort of a blurry area between machines that can play games and machines that can serve a dual purpose and also play something more educational.
Yeah. And, even at that time, um, if there was a desire for a family to invest in a personal computer, they did not invest in the imagination machine console. They would go ahead and buy a separate personal computer.
I see. And what year was the Imagination Machine out again?
The imagination machine came out in 1978.
Okay. So this is just after the big, we call it the Precambrian explosion in 1977, right? Where you have the Apple II, the PET, and the TRS-80 all
Correct.
coming out. Yeah. So you did have some pretty stiff competition there.
Oh,
Seems.
yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. Um, well, what did you work on with? Well, sorry, let me ask. What was the ultimate fate of APF? Did they get bought out, or sell the company, or go under?
They
Or?
they went under. They were liquidated.
Ah, okay. That's too bad.
Yeah.
They certainly made an impact. Um, how many imagination machines do you think were made? in total? I'm very curious to know.
I would guess that there were probably in the neighborhood of maybe 20,000.
Okay,
That sounds about right.
right. And the same, like maybe a slightly larger number of the MPF 1000.
Well, the MP 1000, that was probably more like 100,000.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Now, are those still readily available in sort of like eBay, or are they all pretty rare now? I know the
Uh,
imagination machine's rare.
the Imagination Machine is definitely rare. The
Yeah.
MP 1000, you might get lucky to find one, but
Mm.
yeah, they're not readily available. I have the entire package.
Yes, that's fantastic. Uh, now, can you tell us about your coworkers a little bit? I've just read about this guy, Irving Boylan. Was that his name? Uh,
Yes.
and was he a fellow engineer at APF? Or
Irving Borland was one of the lead engineers, and he was one of the guys who would go back and forth between the US and overseas to work with the folks there to build the console units. So Irv was Ken Boylan's father, and Ken Boylan was my boss.
oh wow, okay. So he was kind of responsible for kind of a production engineer, I guess, right? He'd go over to.
He was an engineer. He was a not computer, electronics engineer.
Hmm.
But yes, production and design engineer.
And I was reading this article in Fast Company, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which is a beautifully written article, by the way, um, about you. And I couldn't believe that someone had made a computer to run JOS, which do you know that language at all? It comes from the Johnny-Ac computer at the Rand Corporation. It's really obscure. I was just wondering if you had any insight into why he chose that language.
I don't. I wish I did, but all
Yeah.
I could tell you is that we knew we needed a language.
Okay.
And for some reason, it was that language that was selected.
Wow. That's really
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. Well, so what happened after? Tell us about your, what happened at APF, and when you left the company, and what happened after.
So since things started to go south at APF, no fault of anyone's other than, we tried to do something that we thought was going to be innovative and that people would latch onto. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. So, I was given the opportunity to look for other employment while still getting a paycheck at APF. That's how nice these folks were.
Mhm.
And it took me a couple of months, and I did find a job at, wait for it, at Apple Computer.
Oh, hey.
And it's interesting that I went to work for Apple in the upstate New York territory as a technical specialist,
Mm.
basically going to all of the Apple dealers and helping them to understand the computers, to make sure they had them properly displayed,
Oh,
and to present at different shows and conferences.
wow. So you really went from kind of an engineer in the laboratory to a very public facing position, which is really great. I mean, that's a wonderful progression of your career to see that. Yeah.
It wasn't expected, but I'll take it.
Did you enjoy that work, or a lot of
Yeah, I
travel, I
did.
guess?
I did. Quite frankly, I really wanted to, and if I were a single man without a family, I would have gone to Silicon Valley,
Mm.
and I would have stayed in the hardware space. But there's just not a lot of jobs in hardware in the northeast part of the United States.
Right.
So I knew I had to do something else. And luckily, I had the ability to get a job at Apple that allowed me to further my career in a way that I didn't expect, but it turned out to work out very, very nicely.
Oh, fantastic. How long did you stay there with Apple?
I stayed with Apple for, well, this is the thing about Apple at that time. The Apple II was doing well. The Apple IIe came out. Uh, I was there maybe 2 years or so, and the Apple Apple themselves decided that they were going to come up with their business computer, and their business computer was called the Apple III. The Apple III was a bigger dud than the Imagination Machine. It didn't sell at all. It stunk.
Right.
I hated pitching that machine.
Uh,
So they took the smart stuff they did with the Apple II and just pushed it aside in favor of this monolithic machine called the Apple III. It failed miserably. They tried to retrench as quickly as they could, and they came out with another miserable mistake, which was the Apple Lisa. And by the time they came out with the Lisa, Apple's stock started to tank. Their revenue was dropping. IBM was already going into the marketplace with their new PC.
right.
So that was the change for Apple at the time.
Right. And the IBM PC, of course, came out in 81, August of 81. So that really put, and it had good and bad effects, right? I mean, it was bad in that all of a sudden everybody had this 800-pound gorilla competitor to deal with. But it was good in the sense that it legitimized the personal computer, which many people had considered up to that time kind of a toy in some ways. You know, they're like not a serious business tool. Um, so yeah, IBM was a mixed blessing, I think. When the Apple III, I remember, and maybe you can tell me if this is true, that there was a problem with the chips, the way they were, the problems with the sockets that they used, and you would actually drop the Apple III about a foot onto a surface and it would reseat the chips. Did you ever hear that one?
I'm sorry, can we pause for a minute, John? Because I think
here, Dag.
Here we go.
Ed Smith. So Ed, the IBM PC was, excuse me, part 5, Ed Smith and Dag. And the IBM PC was like a shot across the bow for many people making PCs and selling software. How did it affect you when you were working for Apple?
yeah, and this is something that I got to take back from when I was at APF and then bring it back to the days when IBM came out with a PC.
Sure.
When we were at APF, we wanted to design the Imagination Machine to be a cartridge-based system like the Apple, so that you can add additional functionality into it as you went on. The folks in our marketing department, they did not want to add functionality. They wanted to ship units. And we lost that battle. And we also lost the battle with the tape drive that was built into it when at the same time, floppy disk drives were just coming out. So then when I was at Apple and we had the Apple IIe, which was a great machine, you pop open the top, you plug in all of your different expansion cards. People loved it. Hobbyists loved it. People were making money because they were building boards for it. That was a great business for not just Apple, but for third parties. So then Apple decided to completely abandon that business when they came out with the Apple III and then the Lisa. So when IBM came out with the PC and I saw the PC, my first reaction was they just took everything in the Apple playbook and put it into the IBM PC. while Apple was abandoning their own playbook. And that hurt to see happen. And Apple never was able to move away from that. They were never able to change what they started at that time. So Apple would go ahead and come up with their next design, which was the Macintosh computer. And the Mac, as you probably know, was a closed environment, no expansion capabilities at all. It sold somewhat okay, but it wasn't really taking off in the marketplace. And Apple themselves were struggling to stay in the computer hardware business. So that was a very disappointing thing to see happen, to see Apple just completely abandon their bread and butter and come up with closed architectures that never sold.
Right. So abandoning the expansion bus and the ability to just plug in cards and was a key feature of that. By the way, can you tell us what is on your wall behind you that looks like a circuit board or something? Is that a part of the Apple II or anything? Or am I not seeing that right? No.
No, it's a computer design, and it's got, I guess you can call them different bits
Mhm.
that are popping out. So it's like an 8-bit architecture computer design.
Oh, nice. Yeah, it looked like something computer related.
Yeah.
But yes, so I think this argument that you're pointing out here about the abandonment of an expansion bus, or expansion slots, I should say, in the Apple III and so on, reflects Steve Jobs, desire to have a closed system, right? And the tension was between Wozniak, who of course wanted an open system. He's a hardware guy. He thinks you should just continually be able to add or subtract to the system as you want. And as you pointed out, that's what people really wanted. And so it was a big philosophical argument, I think, between Wozniak and Jobs as to whether to have an open system or not.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I can tell you that um, while I was still with Apple, I heard the rumblings as to why Jobs decided to leave Apple. And the main reason was that he lost control of the engineering environment at Apple. And his desire was to continue to have open architecture technology. I mean, just look at what IBM did with the PC. Look at all of the manufacturers of cards
Oh, yeah.
that would go into that machine. These companies made tons of money from the IBM PC.
Yeah.
Now, of course, again, things mature and now everything is built into the box. But at one time, you had an environment where people could just make tons of money, and they loved working with companies like not just IBM, but of course the clones would come out. So you had this huge now environment of IBM compatibles that you would never see with Apple. There has never been an Apple compatible at all.
Right. Um, and so how long did you stay with Apple and what sort of made you decide to leave?
Well, I was laid off. Apple started losing money.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I was there for maybe 3 years, I think, 4 years, and then they just started losing money. When they did not sell the Lisa, they really started going into the wrong direction, and they had to retrench. So I left Apple in 82, 83.
Right. That sounds about right for the Lisa. And the Mac, of course, came out in '84.
Right.
And when that came out, I'm sure it didn't sell very well.
Nope.
Actually, nobody really knew what to do with it. And it took at least a year before I think sales started to pick up.
Well, even when the Mac did come out, just to get it to boot up, you had to keep flipping floppy disks back
Right.
and forth into the machine, and you really couldn't do a lot with it at that time. I think all you had was 16K of memory at the time.
Hmm.
So they had some growing pains, and I don't think they really overcame those growing pains, um, because the Mac, even though it's a great computer today, but the IBM PC world just completely dominated the marketplace.
Yeah. And how did that impact your choice of jobs, your next job? Did you work in? Well, tell us what you did.
Well, so once I was out of Apple,
Yeah.
I tried to figure out what was my next step. And one thing I started to realize as I was learning more about the industry and the things that go on in the industry, um, it became apparent to me that you have this world where you can be working on the design of things. You can work in the delivery of products, and you can also work at the retail end, or you can be a consultant.
Mhm.
So I started to see all of these different roles that were available for me to latch onto. And I wanted to, first of all, just get a job. And I was lucky enough to have already known the folks at a company called the Computer Factory. And the Computer Factory was one of those retailers where when I went out to pitch the Imagination Machine with the sales guys, we pitched it to Jay Gottlieb at the Computer Factory. And so as I was looking to get new employment, I called Jay Gottlieb. And sure enough, he had an opportunity for me to open up the Philadelphia region for the Computer Factory. So I went
Wow.
into the retail end of the business.
Right. And now, what was your position there? Was it sales or managerial stuff? Or
Yeah, I was the sales man. I was the regional manager, I guess. Yes.
okay, so you had salespeople reporting to you, I guess.
Hmm.
Yeah. And what were the main products that you were selling?
This is where it really gets fun, right? Because again, when you're so uh, enamored with changes in technology, all of the new things that are coming out, and then you have an opportunity to work at a retailer where you pretty much see everything
Mhm.
that's new coming out. And
Well,
even if you didn't see everything new, you knew there were things that were out there that you should at least convince your managers to adapt, to take on.
right.
So at the Computer Factory, we were selling the IBM PCs, the IBM clones, the compact luggables, but we were also selling um, optical character recognition systems at the time, OCR systems. We were selling uh, networking systems, right? There was Banyan Networks, there
Oh
was the
yeah.
Corvus OmniNet, and there was the Novell network.
Mhm.
So we were selling network. Well, I say we, that was my charter when I got to the factory, was to convince management that you need to sell not just PCs, but you need to sell these add-on solutions that really make the PC a better system for business. So I convinced the factory to take on the networking stuff, optical character generation stuff, uh, computer aided drafting stuff.
Oh,
So
wow.
I was involved in a lot of those new initiatives at the computer factory.
Right.
So that by the time I was looking to move on, I had a ton of knowledge in those different technologies, none more so than the knowledge I had in computer networking, which actually got me the job at Novell that I was with for 13 years.
Wow. So I was just going to ask you before we get to Novell is at this time, people are just sort of barely appreciating the importance of connecting computers together and how
Yep.
networks might be useful for that. And I guess obviously having a print, being able to share resources like printers was a big driver of that. Can you tell us a bit about what people's perceptions about networks were at the time? Did they see value in connecting their computers together, or did you really have to convince them that this was a useful technology?
Well, when you are talking to a corporation, a large business, or a law firm, or an accounting firm, when you're talking to these companies that understand the importance of being able to share information, that was the most important thing about networking, the ability to share information. So a lot of these different firms, just based on the way their business ran, understood the importance of computer networking, which made it a very easy sell. If you try to go into an environment where it's less likely that they would understand the importance of being able to share information, you may not get a great sell. You wouldn't get a great sell if you go into a manufacturing environment and try to sell them computer networking. It's just not going to happen, right?
Right.
Um, in manufacturing, you do one thing, you do it, and you get it done, and that's it. But if you are in a law firm and you've got multiple documents that have to be shared back and forth, and if you've ever been in a law firm before computer networking, and you could see the amount of floppy disk drives that would go, floppy disks that would go back and forth from
Right.
one room to the other, you understand the importance of computer networking.
That's that's a great point. They call that sneaker net, right? You wear your running shoes.
Sneaker net, you got it. That's right.
Did you have to deal, at the time, of course, you had this big MIS, what they used to call MIS, right? Management Information Systems infrastructure that was largely mainframe based. And did you have to interact with that that type
Oh,
of business? And how did that go? It must have been a bit of a tough sales job in some cases.
yeah. So, the thing that we tried to do was to avoid contact with people in MIS. I mean, that was because their jobs were on the line. They did not want to see this upstart networking thing infringe on the way they did their job over the last 30 years or whatever it was, right?
Right, right.
They wanted their green screen terminals. They wanted people to access those terminals with their normal logins plugged into the wall, and they didn't want to change that at all. In fact, it took a lot, and I can remember the days in the early days of the PC, it took a lot just for an employee to bring a PC into their job and put it on their desk. That was almost a no-no at one point. And then all of a sudden, these PCs started to just proliferate. And now that they're there, they go, well, I guess we should connect them, right? So it wasn't as though they had this grand plan to say, we're going to invest in all of these PCs and bring them in, and we'll network them together. This all happened through a morphing type of a situation. It's like, I don't want to do it, but I guess I have to do it because everybody's doing it.
Wow. So people maybe at the departmental level had, or the work group level, sort of went out and got their own stuff, their own PCs,
Yeah, that's
because
exactly what happened.
they were so cheap, they could
They were
afford
so
to do
cheap
that.
and they could get their jobs done.
Right.
So,
Well,
and they
that's
didn't have to wait for the mainframe.
right. Now, what was the ultimate impact of that? I mean, I guess mainframes, they're still used, obviously, but not in the same way, maybe, or
Well, yeah, mainframes are always going to be around. There is always a purpose for uh, large, high functionality type systems like mainframe computing, especially when you look at um, areas like artificial intelligence and, you know, um, virtual reality, to design certain things in programs like uh, space exploration. There's always going to be a need for um, high capacity computing. So that's not going to go away. The key thing that did happen though is the computing power became so so powerful that you didn't need a mainframe to do certain things anymore. And that's
right.
where the PC really came about. It shined because there was now this desire for people to say, I can do this without having to worry about getting onto a mainframe to make this kind of stuff happen. And the computing power at the desktop level over the years, I mean, we started from a 4-bit microprocessor. And by the time we got to 64 bits, I mean, it's like, that's it. Why do we need anything else, right? The average consumer, and I tell this to my friends, and they always ask me, is they say, so, what kind of computer should I buy? Should I buy the new 64-bit blah, 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 or should I buy the 32-bit, and I go, look, the only thing you're going to do with that thing is you're going to do word processing, you're going to do some email, and that's it. Don't buy the biggest box that you see out there. You're
Right.
never going to use all of that computing power. Nobody does.
Yeah.
There's just too much power right now.
In fact, I'm using a 2012 Mac, which just shows you that the amount of power that I really need peaked about 8 years ago. I just don't need a faster laptop. It's
That's
ridiculous.
it.
Like
Exactly.
Word doesn't need to run any faster than it does already.
Yeah, but
Anyway,
then you have the advertisements. They're always pushing the new powerful processor, blah blah blah. And I'm going, guys, this is just like somebody trying to tell you you need an 8-cylinder engine in
yeah,
your
a
in your
Ferrari.
your Ferrari. Yeah, exactly. And you can't even go more than 70 miles an hour on the highway. So
Yeah, exactly. Great. Well, let's pivot to Novell and your career there. How did you hear about that? How did you start? And you didn't have to go to Utah, did you? Or I mean, to work in Utah, or were you working back east? Can you tell us a bit about that?
okay. So the way I got the job at Novell was I was actually at the computer factory doing some work there, and I did a presentation at a computer club. I can't recall what the name of that computer club was, but there was probably a good 100 people in the room.
Mm.
And the presentation was about different networks. So it was Corvus, it was Banyan, and it was Novell. And I was really just there to share my insights as to what the differences were between those networking systems. So I got done. A guy walks up to me and he says, I'm with Novell. You just did a great presentation. How would you like to come work for us?
Oh, wow.
And that's exactly how that happened. And I said, I would love to come work for you. And sure enough, pretty much just like that, in 1988, I was a employee of Novell. And yes, I did go to Utah a lot.
Mm.
I mean, I was in Utah maybe once a month or once every other month for the
Wow.
first 5 years or so of employment at Novell. And I enjoyed every single time being in Utah. That is a beautiful place. I mean, it's just, forget Sears Tower at that point. When I saw Utah, I go, this is God's heaven.
Wow. Yeah.
So yes, I would always go to Utah. Novell's office was in just outside of Salt Lake City,
Mhm.
just south of Salt Lake City, Sandy, Utah, and Provo, Utah, actually. And they had a nice office there. The president of Novell was a mentor of mine, Ray Norda, who was an ex-engineer himself, military guy. We got along extremely well. And unfortunately, Ray didn't stay long enough. He started the company when he was already in his 70s.
Wow.
So he wasn't able to last long. He got dementia pretty early on.
Oh,
But he was a great person to have learned quite a few things around the environment of software sales.
right. Now, what kind of things did he instill in you? Like give you ways of approaching customers, those kind of things? Or
Yeah. Well, one of the first things Ray would say is if he would look at your watch, and if you were wearing a Rolex or a Movado, he would say, "You see my watch? This watch cost me $10. It tells time." That's Ray, right?
yeah.
If you would pick Ray up in your car from the airport, which I did from time to time, and one of my colleagues had a Mercedes, Ray told my colleague, "Why do you have this car? You don't need this car." Right? He said, "You spend twice as much for a car when all you need is a Ford." That's Ray.
Very practical.
So he was an all shucks kind of guy.
Yeah.
And that's really what I learned from Ray. You don't need to be um, uh, something that you're not. Be who you are, you know, and appreciate what you have, and understand that just because there are things out there that have more bells and whistles, can do things a little bit better, at one point you have to understand why you're purchasing a product. And that's the thing I learned from Ray. You purchase a product for a specific functionality. And as long as you remember that, you don't go ahead and spend more money than you should on a product that can give you the same functionality for a lot less.
Right. Now, did that philosophy have an impact on product development, like in terms of providing very simple to use, get up and running pretty quickly with Novell? That was an important part of their conception, or like I'm just trying to think, like compared to say something which I don't want to say it's rudimentary. That's not correct, but it's not like it's not the Ferrari. It's a Chevy. Maybe is the best way.
Yeah,
Is that a fair enough comparison?
that's exactly it. And so during the developments of the networking operating system, it was that same philosophy. Ray wasn't looking to build um, a mainframe operating system, right?
Right.
Ray said, "We have this PC here. This PC has certain functionalities that we can take advantage of. And those functionalities can be leveraged in a networking operating system." And that's what he built.
What was going on in the world of networking generally at this time? This was really the sort of networking heyday, I think, right? Where there were multiple vendors, and you had, I think, Scott McNeely or somebody, his son, said the network is the computer. That, hey, the network is actually really, really important, and it's like it's a real thing in itself, and
Yeah,
it
yeah.
it needs experts to just, know how it works and set it up for you and get the most out of it. So,
Yes. Yeah, I remember that line, the network is the computer. And that really goes back to the fact that when you started to connect computers together, the concept was you are leveraging multiple microprocessors in a networked environment so that you can utilize that power of the entire network.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's Metcalfe's law, I guess, the Ethernet guy who did Ethernet, said, the power, I forget what, he's got a little equation, it's very basic, but it basically says the more people on the network, the more useful the network is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, the point is that um, when you start to proliferate the network, it's very difficult to pull it back,
Mm,
right? So as more people start to log on to networks,
mhm,
they're logging on for a specific reason. It could be to tap into the computing power of another PC. It could be to grab different files from another PC.
mhm.
It could be to leverage some type of a hardware capability that's only on that PC, but it's all within the network. And as long as that network is available to you, you can latch onto any of those types of computing environments.
Right. How did Novell, I think of as sort of the eventual winner of the network wars? I don't know if you share that belief, but certainly for a while they were a market leader. How did you differentiate Novell's products from the others?
So Novell was somewhat unique in that um, Novell had a very large community of users. And this is before MIS was really providing oversight on the networking part of the
Mhm.
business. And Novell had a very, very strong community of users as well as dealers who would go out and push the networks to these different firms. And these dealers knew exactly who to target when it came time to sell Novell networks. So they knew who needed this stuff, right? They
Right.
knew accounting firms needed networking. They knew law firms needed networking. Um, there were a number of different businesses just based on the nature of their business where networking just made sense. And they went after that business. Um, on the other hand, you had companies like IBM. And if you think about their business, which was still mainframe,
Right.
and IBM did have a token ring network.
Mm.
And I can tell you because I was pushing Novell at the time against IBM, the last thing IBM wanted to do was to sell their customers token ring networks. They didn't want to sell them networks at all.
Oh,
They just wanted to keep selling them the mainframe.
oh,
Keep your terminal, no problem, everything's fine. That was the business IBM was in at the time.
mm,
However, the client was saying, well, we think we have a need for networking, so it's either going to be you or it's going to be somebody else. So IBM would give in and say, okay, if you want the network, here it is, it's token ring. And it was just okay. It didn't do a lot of the things that Novell did. In fact, Novell was one of the first networks that allowed for you to have email communication
oh, really?
between desktops.
Wow, that's a very interesting little feature.
Yep,
Yeah.
that was a very important feature.
Oh my goodness. So everyone on the network could send emails to anyone else.
Yep,
Wow,
exactly.
I never knew that. How interesting. Um, Do you have any interesting customer stories of Novell customers?
Ooh. So this is going to go back to the token ring story that I was just about to,
Mm,
that I stopped at, but I'm gonna build on that.
sure.
Um, so one of the biggest clients Novell had at the time was Campbell Soup in New
Huh?
Jersey, and they also had Pepperidge Farm.
Oh, yeah.
And we had sold them a lot of Novell networks, a lot of Novell operating systems, Novell servers. And we had a meeting scheduled. And the meeting was to identify areas where additional Novell operating systems could be installed. So I go to the meeting. I had one of the technical specialists with me. We walk into the conference room, and IBM is sitting there. And I look up at the CIO and I said, "Is there a reason why they're here?" And he says, "Oh, no, they're just going to share their insights into what they think needs to happen around their piece of the business." That's the way he positioned it. So I sat back, IBM gets up, and they put up a chart. And the chart has a line by line comparison of Novell Network versus IBM Token Ring Network. And this person is going back and forth saying, Token Ring is better at this because of this. Novell can't do that. And I stopped him right in the middle of his presentation. I said, I am not sitting through this. We are leaving. If you expect us to be able to compete with IBM on what we know is a better product, then you are delusional, and I am just going to walk out. And the
Wow.
CIO actually said, I'm sorry, you're right. I should not have put you through this. And he threw IBM out of the room. But now it gets more interesting than this because IBM was a Novell customer as well.
Oh,
IBM sold Novell networks as well.
oh, interesting.
Oh, yeah. So when they threw IBM out, IBM called our vice president of sales. I get back to my office. He calls me and he goes, What did you do? And I told him, I said, I wasn't going to sit there and let those guys just berate us like that. And he said, You know, that took a lot of balls, but you did exactly the right thing.
Oh,
So
that's
that was the
great.
IBM story at Novell.
Wow. Yeah, it's pretty unfair to set you up like that.
Oh, but
Not,
it's
not
not the
good.
first thing that kind of thing happened. As I learned in the business that we're in, sometimes you get blindsided.
Yeah, right. Well, Novell sounded like, what year? Can you tell us the years that you were there, just so we get the chronology right?
Yeah, I was at Novell from 1988 through 2001.
Okay, great. And any other Novell stories before we move on?
Oh man,
I'm sure you have lots.
yeah. The one story that I think about quite a bit is, you have um, a law firm in Philadelphia called Morgan Lewis and Bockius, and it's a pretty good sized law firm, and they were hesitant in investing in a network. And I went out with the sales rep, and Morgan Lewis was looking at Banyan. In fact, they purchased Banyan.
Mhm.
And the rep told me that we could take Banyan out because it wasn't performing the way the client expected them to. So when we got to the firm and we saw the way Banyan was installed, we knew it wasn't the problem with Banyan. It was the problem with the person who installed it. But we didn't tell the client that. We just told the client, this is a bad network. You need Novell. And he pulled Banyan out and put Novell in, and everything else was great after that. But that was the key thing about networking at that time. The systems were great if you implemented them correctly.
Sure.
You know, back in those days, it wasn't very easy to configure networks. You had to know a lot about the intricacies of the hardware that you were connecting to and the operating environment that you were setting up.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah.
You remember every time you added a card to a PC, you had to set the interrupts and
The NIC cards and the interrupts, yeah.
yeah,
Exactly.
it's not easy for a regular person. They don't
Nope.
really know how to do that. So anyway, so okay, what happens after Novell, Ed? Now at 2001.
2001, Novell, by the way, they started to go under. The networking business became commoditized, and that was due to Microsoft. So all of a sudden, everything that was being sold as a network operating system was now being built into Microsoft Windows.
Okay.
So networking was now a part of Windows, and it just took Novell's business completely out of the marketplace. So yeah, I was laid off from Novell, and I went to work for a company called Infosys,
Oh yeah.
which is a Indian-based IT consulting and outsourcing firm. And I
Right.
decided to take that job. And I was just thinking about the trajectory of my own career. And I'm thinking, okay, look, I've been doing design work on video games and personal computers. I've been in retail. I've been managing dealers. And I've worked for one of the biggest software firms in the industry. I think I should look at what they do on the other side of the business, which is the consulting side. And I went to work for Infosys in consulting. And my primary role, by the way, was strategic partnerships, right? So I was responsible for bringing in new partners based on certain technologies that we wanted to adapt and deliver services around. And that was my role at Infosys. So now I'm spending a lot of time in India.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Yeah, yeah.
That's a long flight.
Oh, yeah.
Well, tell us a bit about the nature of your work at Infosys. I know it's a gigantic company with a global presence.
Yeah, yeah. Well, when I started with Infosys, they were maybe $800 million in revenue.
Okay.
Today, I think they're $20 billion in revenue.
Wow.
But yeah, when I started, they were just growing. They were just starting out. They were just getting their feet wet around the things they wanted to do. And I was one of the people who helped them to grow their business through partnerships.
Ah, wonderful. I was always interested in how the Indian IT industry, which seems to have, I'm not saying it started at this time, but it seemed to have really taken off. There's Tata, there's Wipro, there's Infosys, and these gigantic IT conglomerates, all based in India. So curious why India? Do you have any insights into that, or?
Well, the best insight I can give you is um, the government of India was astute enough to understand that they had a population of people who needed to have access to employment as much as possible. And the the way the technology was moving at the time allowed for the government to invest in certain companies. Tata was the first, and allow those companies to hire people in India, train them on different technologies. It could have been programming. In fact, it was the whole area around 1999, 2000, when the clock was going to be the big problem, and people didn't have a lot of COBOL expertise. They had people in India who knew COBOL. So they would be doing a lot of the re-engineering of systems to prepare for that change of the clock. So they were able to start there and then build their business up by adding additional offerings time over time.
That is a really interesting insight. Yeah, the Y2K problem.
That's correct.
Totally interesting. Wow. Thank you for that. Um, well, what's happening over at Infosys? Are you, it's mainly a public-facing job, I guess, where you're connecting people together. Is that kind of what you're doing? Or?
Yeah, the job at Infosys is around making sure that you have the right technology that solves a business problem at the right time. So, over the years, and you know this, I mean, the number of software companies that are out there today is just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
So if you have to have an enterprise client, a worldwide client who is going to require some type of software technology to help move their business, you have to be able to help that client in every geography where that client has a presence and deliver that solution so that all of that becomes seamless to the end user. That's a monumental task just for one piece of technology.
Mm.
So if you've got a client, think of a client who uses SAP, right?
Right.
Big software platform. SAP is huge, multinational.
Mm-hmm.
You have people at Infosys who would work for a single client just on SAP. That's their career,
Oh yeah,
you know,
for sure.
right? It's
Yeah,
just amazing.
I know. Yeah, we just adopted Salesforce at the museum, and it's kind of the same thing, you know. It's not
Yeah,
just software; it's a lifestyle.
it's a lifestyle. Exactly. So yeah. And now everyone has moved to the cloud, software as a service, or anything as a service, I guess.
Right.
But yes, I mean, that's just, again, the way technology is moving. Boy, it's just, you got to keep up.
Yeah, it's almost impossible, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
But well, are you still working for Infosys, or what? What?
No, no. I left Infosys 8 years ago.
Okay.
Went to work for a company called Kronos,
Oh
and
yeah.
that's because I had a friend of mine who was the um, senior director of strategic alliances there,
Mm.
and he needed some help to bring in new partners. So I went to work with him for the last 5 years of my career before I decided to go ahead and retire.
Wonderful. And what does Kronos do? Or
Kronos is one of the leading providers of workforce management software.
okay.
And the big thing about Kronos that is important is if you think about employees, not just any employee, but if you are a employee working in a retail environment or a manufacturing environment or even a hospital environment, healthcare, these employees have schedules. These schedules have to be maintained. Shifts have to be approved,
Oh
met,
yeah.
moved around. swapped between employees.
Oh, okay.
There is not a lot of software companies in workforce management who can handle employee scheduling.
Mm.
That's what Kronos does better than anybody else.
Oh, wow. That's great.
Yeah.
And so maybe just as we wrap up, you can tell us a little bit because your Infosys job and the Kronos job sound somewhat similar, and you're the building strategic alliances and so on. How do you, can you unpack that for us a little bit? Like, how do you know, how do you find people to, bring into to Infosys or to the other company,
Ooh.
to Kronos?
See, that's the secret sauce of a guy like me, right? So what you learn over time is how to make the right connections. And you start off by sitting down with your management team, your sales team, understanding what their clients are asking them to do. So at Infosys, for example, we could have a client who would say, we are in need of a um, master data management solution. So the client is Goldman Sachs.
Mm.
And a master data management solution is a product or series of products that would allow you to have a complete 360-degree view of that individual's entire portfolio, not just that individual's portfolio, but their wives, their kids, and kids that had not even been born yet.
Oh my gosh.
So if they're asking for a master data management solution, you then have to go out and figure out who is the best company to partner with to deliver a solution like that to a firm like Goldman Sachs.
I see.
And that's not easy to do.
No, no, it must be very relationship driven, I would think.
Extremely the relationship. Yes.
Yes, right. Well, that's great. Tell us a bit about what you've been doing since you've retired and you're living in Florida, which sounds very nice. Uh,
Yeah.
what's
Yeah.
life
So
been
since
like?
I've left the grind, if you will.
Mm,
And by the way, the reason that I did leave Kronos was the level of inquiries that I was getting over the years, starting at about, I say maybe 15, 20 years ago. I started getting a lot of inquiries as to what I did at APF with the Imagination Machine and the MP1000 video game. And a lot of those inquiries turned out to be um, things that were published, like Fast Company.
okay.
And as the publications started to come out, I started to get a lot of the requests to do interviews. And I also came to the realization that I need to make sure that this story is fully documented. So I went ahead and I wrote a book, and it's aptly named Imagine That.
Yes, I have it. It's
You have
great.
it.
I
All
love it.
right.
Yeah.
So it took me a little time to write the book, got the book done. And since the book has been published, I can say to you that almost every other week I am on a call with a writer talking about my time
Oh,
at APF.
that's wonderful.
Yeah,
Well, I hope you think it's wonderful. It might
it's
get
great.
tiring after a while. Yeah. Oh, well, that's great. Uh, so any last minute thoughts you'd like, any parting thoughts you'd like to leave with us, Ed, as we sign off?
Well, first of all, I have to say that I am truly appreciative of the Computer History Museum allowing for me to tell this story. Um, if there was any institution that is worthy of positioning my story, it is the Computer History Museum. So I truly do appreciate that. And if there was one final thing that I would say, is there are so many things in the world of technology that I will never have a chance to appreciate, but I am so happy to have been able to work in at least this piece of technology. And for that alone, I am truly humbled.
Wow. Wonderful, Ed. Thank you so much. Thank you for those kind words. And just one inspiration maybe for children of color. Do you have any inspiration, any words for them, like uh, how to realize their dreams?
Yeah. Um, Key thing here is, first of all, never listen to anyone say you cannot do something. That's first and foremost. If you believe you can do it, go out and do it. You can do it. You just have to be able to take the time to learn that piece of the technology. And you can learn it in stages. It doesn't have to be something that you have to do in one felt swoop.
Right.
So don't be discouraged by anyone who tells you you cannot do something. You can do it, and you just have to take the time to study it and become proficient at it. And once you have proficiency, you will have profitability as well.
Thank you so much, Ed.